The topic of law reform for my presentation is interprovincial trade barriers within Canada. Since President Trump's retaking of the office in February of 2025, he has waged a trade war against over 60 nations, including those a part of CUSMA, the Canada, USA, and Mexico Trade Agreement, which originally allowed for one of the largest areas of free trade in the world besides the EU. Still, under the current tariffs, roughly 85% of Canada's exports are covered. However, the exports that aren't covered have caused great damage. It is for this reason that many countries, including Canada, were hoping that the Supreme Court of the United States would rule against the President under Article 1 of the Constitution, which only delegates the authority to impose taxes to Congress. Such a ruling did eventually come after many months, but this has done little to slow the President's tariff agenda, with new wide-reaching tariffs on labor being announced last Wednesday at the time of recording, which is June 3rd. The impact these tariffs have had on the Canadian economy is devastating, to say the least. Statistics Canada has reported contractions of GDP in 3 of the 4 quarters under this trade war. This meets the minimum definition for a technical recession that is held among many economists. In many ways, this recession is similar to the recession in 2015 that happened after global oil prices crashed and also crippled many industries in Western Canada. Since the beginning of this trade war, Prime Minister Carney has repeatedly argued that we must become our own best customer if we wish to stick through and have a good economy during this trade war. It is for this reason that discussions of interprovincial trade barriers have once again become relevant, as Canada cannot become its own best customer when trading within itself is so difficult. In order to look at how these problems could potentially be resolved in future, we first need to look at what the roots of the problem are. In reality, the roots of many of the current issues with interprovincial trade can be traced all the way back to the Confederation debates of 1865. Many of the fathers of Confederation had conflicting views on what the Constitution should look like and what Canada should look like. Sir John Macdonald is quoted as saying that he prefers a legislative union over a federalist system, which is closer to what we have today. Such a legislative union would have a much stronger federal government that would have prevented many of the interprovincial trade barriers that is seen today. However, it would have restricted the rights of provinces, as noted by Sir Carter, who stated that such a legislative union would have imposed tyranny of majority on the smaller provinces. In particular, being a Quebec man himself, he was worried about the status of Quebec's culture in such a homogenized system. These concerns were not unwarranted, as at the time the American Civil War was still being actively fought. And Sir Carter is quoted as saying in a debate, "And now we saw the sad spectacle of a country torn by civil war and brethren fighting against brethren." The results of these differing views was compromise within the Constitution. Sections 91 and 92 almost seem contradictory in some of the authorities that they provide. Section 91 assigns Parliament jurisdiction over the regulation of trade and commerce and currency and coinage. This makes it seem like the Constitution was providing the necessary authorities to the federal government to effectuate proper interprovincial trade. However, Section 92 provides authority to provinces over property and civil rights, and also licensing. This division allows provinces to indirectly limit provincial trade and flow of human capital between provinces. Section 121 of the Constitution was intended to mitigate such fragmentation by providing that all articles of growth, produce, manufacture of any of the provinces shall be admitted free into each of the other provinces. A broad interpretation of this section of the Constitution would have established a strong framework and guarantee for free internal trade within Canada, as desired by John A. Macdonald. However, the courts have routinely ruled that such an interpretation is not the correct interpretation. We will now look at 2 broad examples of interprovincial trade barriers, and I will provide an example for each. The first broad category is provincial licensing barriers. Under the current system, provinces regulate skilled labor through separate provincial statutes and separate provincial bodies. For examples of skilled labor that is licensed in Ontario, there is over 100 skilled trades that are licensed, including welding, cooking, etc., and even hairstyling, which is often cited as an example of overregulation. In general, licenses from one province are not respected in another province, thus meaning if you work across multiple provincial lines, you must obtain multiple licenses, and if you wish to move to another province, you must transfer your license. The processes to do these things depend entirely on the province and the legislative body for that individual license, so there are no general rules that I can give you on how this is accomplished. However, within Ontario, we have the Labour Mobility Act, which provides that Ontario provincial licensing bodies must allow a deemed membership, which is a one-time temporary license that gives 6 months of licensing to members of other province bodies who are working in Ontario. If you are an accountant, CPA Ontario offers such a deemed license under Regulation 7-1 of their bylaws. Additionally, CPA Ontario allows members of good standing with other provincial CPA bodies to transfer their license without any additional fees, which is in accordance with the Ontario Labour Mobility Act. This seems like an effective solution for solving provincial licensing barriers. However, if we look at the US, which is itself a federalist system that handles licensing on a jurisdiction-by-jurisdiction basis, they allow CPAs that are on good standing with their current licensing body to practice in any of the 55 licensing jurisdictions without a jurisdiction-specific license. This is clearly a much more painless solution than the current Canadian offering. The next broad category we're looking at is the physical goods barriers that exist between provinces. Most commonly cited is alcohol, which is regulated by individual liquor control boards, such as the Liquor Control Board of Ontario, LCBO. The results of these trade barriers have been a 40% domestic market penetration by Canadian alcohol producers, which has remained mostly unchanged over the last 2 decades. There have been recent efforts and actually progress in the direct-to-consumer agreements for alcohol shipments. In April 2025, only 3 jurisdictions within Canada supported such a sale, but by December 2025, 11 jurisdictions had signed an agreement to allow direct-to-consumer alcohol sales. Additionally, Bill C-262, a Conservative private member bill, seeks to amend the Canada Post Corporation Act to allow direct-to-consumer alcohol shipping through Canada Post. Now that we have covered both the broad categories of interprovincial tariffs, we can see that current policy reform and efforts broadly just serve to work within the current system and not fixing the actual roots of the problem. So that brings us to what I think the current policy options are for reducing interprovincial trade barriers without just treating the symptom, but treating the problem. Perhaps the easiest is to simply strengthen Section 121 of the Constitution. Although the Supreme Court ruled that the section does not create an internal free trade zone within Canada, there is still not a decision on whether or not Section 121 of the Constitution should be able to be used by the Supreme Court in order to amend provincial legislation that needlessly interferes with trade. For example, many of the acts, such as the Public Accounting Act 2004, that set up the licensing bodies within the province, could just as easily name CPA Ontario as CPA Alberta and other CPA organizations. And this brings me to my next point, that the Ontario Labour Mobility Act could also easily be amended so that members of good standing in other provincial bodies would be allowed to work in Ontario without an Ontario-specific license, similar to how CPAs and other licensed professions are treated within the US. And this leads into my third point, which is there should be a stronger national model for these licensing bodies. Many of the licensing bodies on the provincial level already have a federal level organization that interfaces between the provincial level organizations. This should be the case for every licensing body in every province. CPA Canada, for instance, manages the relations between the different provincial CPA bodies. And this also means that any potential issues that could arise from broadening acts such as the Ontario Labour Mobility Act to allow members of other provincial licensing bodies to work in the province without a province-specific license could be taken up to these umbrella licensing bodies. Here are the references that I used for the presentation. I heavily recommend that if you are going into a licensed field, such as an accountant or a lawyer, that you do some research on your provincial licensing body to see what rights you might have in future to transfer or hold multiple memberships in future, especially if you plan on moving out of the province at some point.